I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, every muscle in my body a lesson in restraint. Across from me, lawyers shuffled papers and family members murmured in low, expectant voices. The room was a shrine to the Grant legacy. Portraits of past patriarchs lined the walls, their painted eyes watching as if to bear witness to my undoing. My husband, Andrew, had been gone only a week. The wound of his sudden death was still raw, the edges jagged and unhealed. But grief had no place here. This gathering wasn't for mourning, it was for division. The lawyer's voice droned on, smooth and detached, like a surgeon describing a procedure he'd performed 100 times. Yet every word he spoke was a blade slicing through the life I'd built with Andrew. I waited for my name. Surely there would be something, a property, a percentage of the company we'd built from the ground up. Some recognition that I hadn't just been a bystander in Andrew's rise. Instead, there was nothing. The lawyer cleared his throat, announcing the final division of Andrew's estate. The entirety of Grant Properties, all associated holdings, assets, and properties are to be transferred to Mr. Matthew Grant. A stunned silence filled the room, broken only by the scratch of a pen as he signed the final page. Then came the blow meant for me. Mrs. Catherine Grant, he continued smoothly, is to receive a modest monthly stipend to cover living expenses. A modest stipend. The words landed like a slap. A pittance, barely enough to keep food on the table, dressed up in legal jargon to disguise the insult. I didn't move. My face remained a perfect mask, smooth and serene. But beneath the surface, my stomach knotted, my pulse thundered, and a cold clarity began to take root. Matthew leaned back in his chair, every bit the victor he imagined himself to be. He looked so much like Andrew in that moment. Same sharp jawline, same confident posture. But where Andrew's strength had been steady and principled, Matthew's was sharp-edged and hollow. A slow, poisonous smile spread across his face. "Don't take it personally, Catherine," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. He slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward me, as if he were doing me a favor. "You were always comfortable, but Andrew knew where the real leadership belonged." The others chuckled softly, eager to align themselves with the new power at the head of the table. I looked at that envelope, then at Matthew. He thought this was the end of me. He thought Andrew's death had stripped me of every weapon, every ounce of influence. But Matthew didn't know the truth. He didn't know that Andrew, brilliant and cautious to the very end, had hidden something within those mountains of paperwork. A single sentence, buried so deeply no one else would ever notice. A clause designed for me and me alone. Matthew hadn't seen it. None of them had, and I had no intention of enlightening them tonight. The room erupted in congratulations as Matthew rose, shaking hands and receiving backslaps from eager investors and opportunistic relatives. I stood quietly, smoothing my skirt, my expression polite and empty. As I walked toward the door, I caught Matthew's eye. He saw nothing in my face but quiet resignation. It was exactly what I wanted him to see. In reality, I was already planning his fall. Out in the cool night air, away from the oppressive weight of that chandelier-lit room, I inhaled deeply and let my shoulders finally relax. My grief was still there, heavy and aching, but beneath it was something sharper, stronger, resolve. He had the throne now, that much was true. But thrones can be stolen. Empires can crumble, and Matthew Grant had just handed me the perfect reason to make sure his did. He could have the throne for now, but I would take the entire kingdom back and make him kneel before me while I did it. When I first met Andrew, he wasn't the towering figure everyone reveres now, the real estate mogul whose name could open any door in Philadelphia. He was simply a man with a dream and a smile that could light up even the bleakest city street. I was 24, working as a junior analyst for a small property management firm. My days were spent behind spreadsheets and zoning maps, my nights studying for certifications that, I hoped, earn me a better position. Andrew walked into that firm one spring morning, tall and confident, wearing a suit that had seen better days, but a determination that was unmistakable. He was pitching a redevelopment project to my boss, a bold plan to transform a block of derelict warehouses into mixed-use spaces. My boss laughed him out of the room. I didn't. Later in the hallway, he caught my eye and grinned. "You looked like the only person in there who believed me." "I did," I admitted. "The numbers make sense. They just don't have the guts." Andrew's grin widened. "Then maybe you and I should talk." That conversation turned into coffee, then dinner, and before long, we were inseparable. Together, we built not just a relationship, but an idea. We dreamed of more than just buying and selling properties. We wanted to revitalize neighborhoods, breathe life into forgotten corners of the city. Andrew was the visionary, the man with charisma who could charm bankers and city planners. I was the strategist, the one who kept the spreadsheets balanced and the contracts airtight. We were two halves of the same engine, moving in perfect sync. As the years passed, our projects grew. We started with one building, then 5, then entire city blocks. Philadelphia began to take notice, so did investors. But Andrew was pragmatic, always mindful of perception. The old guard in the industry, the ones who controlled the big deals, preferred their wives to stay in the background. So while Andrew and I built our empire side by side, publicly he stood alone. "It's just to simplify things," he'd reassure me when I bristled at the lack of acknowledgement. "You know the truth, and I know the truth. That's all that matters." And for a long time, that was enough. Then there was Matthew. Andrew's younger brother drifted into the business like smoke under a door. Charming, smooth-talking, always ready with a joke or a handshake, Matthew seemed harmless at first, but I never trusted him. He had Andrew's good looks, but none of his vision, none of his discipline. Where Andrew believed in building legacies, Matthew believed in shortcuts. He loved backroom deals and quick payoffs, and he was always whispering to Andrew about ways to grease the wheels with politicians and contractors. Andrew humored him, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of guilt for always overshadowing his younger brother. But I saw the hunger in Matthew's eyes. It wasn't admiration, it was envy. Over the years, Matthew's influence grew. He became the charming face investors loved to have around, while I remained in the shadows, as Andrew had insisted. It was a delicate balance, and I often wondered how long it could last. One night, long before any of this nightmare began, Andrew and I sat in our study, a bottle of wine half empty between us. He was uncharacteristically quiet, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. "If anything ever happens to me," he said finally, his voice low and serious, "there's a way to protect you, a way to make sure Matthew can't touch what's rightfully yours." My chest tightened. "Andrew, what are you talking about?" He gave me a small, wry smile. "Just trust me. There's a clause in my legal papers, buried deep. Only you will know where to look. Promise me, Catherine, you'll remember this conversation." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. "I promise." At the time, I thought it was just Andrew being cautious, a man who'd built an empire and didn't want to see it crumble. Now, sitting alone in the echoing silence of our estate, I understood the truth. He hadn't just left me a lifeline, he'd left me a weapon. Matthew thought Andrew had left me powerless, that he'd stripped me of everything and forced me into dependency. But Andrew had seen this coming. He had prepared me, even if I hadn't realized it then. Matthew thought Andrew left me powerless. He didn't know Andrew had already given me the keys to the kingdom. The first time Matthew stood at the podium where Andrew once commanded the room, it was almost laughable. Almost. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton gleamed beneath rows of crystal chandeliers, cameras flashing like a storm as reporters jostled for position. Andrew's company, our company, was being introduced to the world under new leadership. Except now, it was all draped in Matthew's name. I stood at the back of the room, near the exit, deliberately invisible among the crowd of investors, developers, and politicians. My black dress was simple, understated. No one turned to acknowledge me. No one even seemed to remember I had once stood at Andrew's side, whispering strategies, reviewing contracts late into the night. Matthew thrived in the spotlight. He stood tall behind the podium, teeth gleaming, his tone dripping with false humility as he thanked the city and Andrew's guidance while making it sound like everything had been his idea all along. Andrew believed in building communities, Matthew said smoothly, his hand over his heart as if he were some benevolent savior. And I intend to carry that vision forward, stronger, bolder, and more ambitious than ever. The crowd applauded, cameras flashing brighter. I didn't clap. My hands stayed folded neatly in front of me, my face perfectly neutral. Inside, however, a storm churned. When Andrew spoke at events like this, there was depth behind his words, purpose. Matthew's speech was all performance, the hollow echo of a man who saw empire not as a legacy, but as a throne to sit on. I caught his eye once, across the sea of faces. His smirk widened, a silent taunt. He knew I was there. He knew this was meant to humiliate me. But I gave him nothing, not even a blink. In the weeks that followed, Matthew's true nature began to show. Reckless acquisitions, backroom deals with developers notorious for cutting corners, entire neighborhoods bulldozed without community buy-in, just to throw up cheap condos he could flip quickly. Andrew had built slowly and carefully, earning trust block by block. Matthew was a wrecking ball, swinging wildly, hungry for profit and attention. I sat back and watched, silent. The mistakes were already stacking up, and he didn't even see it. Then came the first insult, dressed up as generosity. A courier arrived one morning with a cream-colored envelope. Inside was a check, a small monthly stipend Matthew had personally decided was appropriate for me. The note included read, "Catherine, I know this transition has been difficult for you. Consider this my way of making sure you're taken care of. Stay comfortable, stay quiet. Matthew, stay comfortable, stay quiet." I folded the note carefully, tucking it back into the envelope without a word. The second insult came swiftly after. 2 weeks later, moving trucks pulled into the driveway of the main estate. Matthew's men who had once worked for Andrew, walked through my home, boxing up furniture, family photos, even Andrew's books. "Mr. Grant says you'll be more comfortable in the guest house near the lake," the foreman said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I walked out of that house with my chin high, the lake wind cool against my face as they shut the door behind me. Matthew probably thought he'd won, that he'd banished me to obscurity, tucked away like an inconvenient relic of Andrew's life. But what he didn't see was the papers I carried with me. Andrew's files, contracts, notes in his handwriting, the very foundations of the empire Matthew now strutted across like a fool. In the small, quiet guest house, I spread them across the desk, my heart steady, my mind sharp. He could have his throne for now. Let him think me powerless, irrelevant, defeated. He thought I was fading into obscurity. I was only fading from sight. The guest house was quiet that night, the lake outside a sheet of black glass reflecting the moonlight. Everyone believed I was sleeping peacefully in my exile. In truth, I hadn't slept in days. Stacks of Andrew's old files surrounded me, spread across the oak desk like pieces of a puzzle only I could solve. His handwriting leapt out from the margins, sharp, decisive notes that reminded me of late nights spent planning together over coffee and blueprints. Those nights felt like a lifetime ago. Since Matthew's takeover, I'd searched every document, every contract, for a clue, anything Andrew might have left behind. His last words to me before that final business trip echoed in my mind. "If anything ever happens to me, there's a way to protect you, but only you will know where to look." I had to believe he'd meant it. When my phone buzzed just past midnight, I didn't even flinch. It was a text from David Lang, Andrew's former lawyer, and one of the few people I trusted completely. "Meet me tomorrow. No one can know." The next morning, I drove into downtown Philadelphia, blending in with the early rush hour traffic. The city was waking up, oblivious to the war brewing just beneath its surface. David's office was tucked into an old brick building on a quiet side street, far from the gleaming towers of Matthew's new headquarters. He looked older than I remembered, gray streaking his dark hair, worry lines etched deep. But his handshake was firm and his voice steady. "Catherine," he said, closing the blinds before we even sat down, I've been waiting for you to come. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. You knew Andrew better than anyone. Tell me, there's something he left me. Something he didn't put in the official will." David hesitated, then slid a manila folder across the desk. "There is, but it's not simple." I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a single, neatly typed document. My eyes scanned the lines, my breath catching as the words came into focus. It was a clause, a single, powerful paragraph buried deep within a decades-old trust agreement. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. Andrew didn't trust Matthew. He knew his brother's greed would eventually drive him to cut corners. So he created a legal trigger, a safeguard. If Matthew engages in unethical practices that put the company or its reputation at risk, control can revert entirely to you. My pulse quickened. Revert to me? You mean I could take everything back? Yes, David confirmed, but it's not automatic. It must be proven. Every violation documented, every unethical deal traced directly back to Matthew. If we move too soon, he'll bury us in litigation. But if we move carefully... He didn't need to finish. I closed the folder, feeling the weight of it settle in my hands. This wasn't just a legal loophole. It was a sword Andrew had placed in my keeping, hidden until the moment I was ready to strike. "Why didn't Andrew tell anyone else?" I asked quietly. "Because secrecy is power," David said simply. If Matthew had even suspected this existed, he would have burned every file and bribed every judge in Philadelphia. Andrew trusted only you. That night, back in the guest house, I sat by the window overlooking the dark lake. For the first time since the will reading, a spark of hope and something sharper flickered inside me. I opened my laptop and began creating folders, spreadsheets, timelines. Every reckless decision Matthew made would be recorded. Every shady land deal, every under-the-table payment, every corner cut. I reached out to a handful of Andrew's most loyal employees, quiet, discreet conversations over coffee or late-night phone calls. Each one agreed to keep me informed, feeding me pieces of the puzzle while Matthew strutted around oblivious. From the outside, it would appear as if I'd accepted my defeat, living quietly in my little guest house while Matthew reigned. Inside these walls, though, a storm was building. Matthew thought he had buried me beneath the weight of that will. What he didn't know was that Andrew had left me more than memories. He had left me a weapon. I only had to choose the moment to unsheath it. Patience became my greatest weapon. While Matthew strutted across gala stages and press conferences like a king ascending his throne, I sat quietly in my guest house, sipping tea and smiling politely at the scraps he tossed my way. He believed my silence meant defeat. In truth, it meant calculation. For the first year, I did nothing. Nothing outwardly, anyway. I let him have his parades, his ribbon cuttings, his endless photo ops. I smiled through gritted teeth when society columns called him a visionary or the heir apparent to Andrew's legacy. Let them praise him. Let him get comfortable. Because comfort breeds carelessness. Every few weeks, an envelope would arrive at my door, hand-delivered by one of my trusted allies inside the company. Sometimes it was James, an accountant Andrew had mentored. Other times it was Sylvia, a sharp young attorney Matthew barely noticed. Each envelope contained a piece of Matthew's growing corruption. Forged signatures, backdated contracts, expedited payments slipped to city officials under the table. I stored every document in a locked cabinet beneath my desk, each one cataloged, labeled, cross-referenced. As the years passed, that cabinet became an arsenal. Matthew never suspected a thing. He was too busy flaunting his wealth, importing luxury cars, throwing extravagant parties, and courting politicians with promises he couldn't possibly keep. He wanted to be seen as untouchable, and in doing so, he stopped paying attention to the details. 3 years into his reign, the first cracks began to show. A luxury development project in the suburbs fell apart after a contractor filed a lawsuit over unpaid bills. Investors whispered their doubts at cocktail parties. Matthew brushed it off with a laugh, assuring them everything was under control. But I knew better. I saw the panic in his quarterly reports, the quiet firings of middle managers, the frantic shuffling of funds between accounts. Through my network, I learned that he was desperate for a quick win, a project that would restore his reputation and silence the murmurs of dissent. That desperation gave me the opening I'd been waiting for. David and I devised a trap so carefully constructed, Matthew never saw the strings until it was too late. We created a shell company, fronted by a developer no one would trace back to me. Through this phantom intermediary, we dangled an irresistible opportunity, a massive tract of land with undisclosed potential. Matthew pounced. He signed the deal without hesitation, blinded by greed and the need for a public victory. What he didn't know was that the deal was riddled with violations, illegal zoning changes, environmental noncompliance, even fabricated permits. The moment his signature hit the paper, I had him. That single act was the smoking gun, the final proof required by the clause Andrew had so carefully hidden years before. I stood at my window that night, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Matthew was somewhere out there, celebrating his win, oblivious to the fact that he had just sealed his own downfall. I thought back to Andrew's words, "If anything ever happens to me, there's a way to protect you." It wasn't just about protection. It was about justice, about making sure the empire we built together didn't fall into Matthew's corrupt hands. I closed the folder on my desk, now bursting with years of evidence. The board was set. Every piece was in position. Matthew thought he was winning, strutting across the board like a conquering king. He didn't know the board was mine, and I was already 3 moves ahead. The night of the gala shimmered with excess. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting shards of light across the ballroom of the historic Philadelphia Ritz-Carlton. Waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne and gold-dusted hors d'oeuvres. The city's most powerful figures were all there: politicians, investors, journalists, the very people who had once cheered for Andrew and now bowed to Matthew. It was Matthew's night, or so he thought. I stood at the edge of the room, unnoticed in my black silk gown, my posture perfect, my expression unreadable. Over the past decade, I'd perfected the art of invisibility. Tonight, I would shed it like a discarded cloak. At the center of the ballroom, Matthew basked in the glow of his illusion. He took the stage to wild applause, raising his glass in a theatrical toast. Behind him, a massive screen displayed images of his latest developments. Towering condos, sprawling luxury estates, projects he'd pitched as proof of his brilliance. He had no idea that those very projects were laced with legal poison, every deal a time bomb I'd planted. "Ladies and gentlemen," Matthew boomed, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "tonight we celebrate vision and progress." When my brother Andrew passed, many doubted whether I could carry on his legacy. Some, he paused, eyes glinting as he scanned the crowd, even whispered that I lacked the strength to lead. His gaze slid to me for the briefest second, a pointed dagger hidden in his charming smile. "Well," he said with a laugh, "I think we've proven those doubters wrong. The numbers speak for themselves. Our company has never been stronger." The crowd clapped politely, their smiles practiced and polite. Then Matthew leaned in, his tone dropping into a mocking lilt. "Of course, not everyone can keep up with the pace of real innovation. Some people are more suited to quiet retirement." A ripple of knowing laughter spread through the room. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. I felt my pulse steady, my breath even. This was my moment. As the applause died down, I moved forward, heels clicking against the polished floor. Conversations faltered as heads turned, following me. I mounted the stage with unhurried grace, every step a declaration. "Thank you, Matthew," I said calmly, taking the microphone from his hand. That was quite the speech. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. I had never spoken at a gala before, never inserted myself publicly into company affairs. Matthew's confident smile faltered. "Catherine, this isn't—" I raised one hand, silencing him without a word. Years of being underestimated made that gesture all the more powerful. "I've remained quiet for a long time," I began, my voice carrying clear and strong, "out of respect for my late husband, out of respect for this company and everyone who helped build it. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. But tonight, that silence ends. From the front row, David Lang stood and handed me a leather folder. I opened it, revealing stamped documents and sealed evidence packets. "These," I said, holding them aloft, "are certified records of fraudulent deals, unlawful zoning agreements, and violations of state and federal law, all signed by Matthew Grant himself." Gasps erupted across the room. Journalists scrambled for their phones, flashes popping like fireworks. Matthew surged forward. "This is absurd. These documents are admissible in court," I cut in smoothly. "And as of this morning, they've been filed with the Pennsylvania Department of State and the Attorney General's office." I turned to the crowd, meeting their stunned eyes one by one. "But more importantly," I continued, "these actions activate a clause in Andrew's will, a clause known only to a select few. As of this moment, full ownership and control of the company legally revert to me." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Matthew's face drained of color. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the stage. This is a setup. You can't." I held up the final page, a court order with the official state seal. "I can." And I did. With deliberate precision, I walked to the podium where the company's ornate brass seal sat. For years, Matthew had treated it like his crown. I lifted it in both hands, turning to face him. "You thought Andrew made you king," I said softly, "but this was never your kingdom." And then, before the eyes of the entire room, I placed the seal in front of me. Matthew collapsed into a chair, humiliated and speechless, as the press swarmed him with questions. I stood tall, serene and unshaken, while the crowd shifted around me, their loyalties realigning in real time. The room didn't just see me that night, I thought, as flashes lit the stage. They saw the truth. And Matthew saw the edge of the cliff he'd been walking toward. Matthew's fall didn't happen with a single dramatic blow. It began with a whisper, small, almost imperceptible changes rippling outward until the entire empire he'd stolen began to crumble beneath him. The morning after the gala, while the headlines still blared my name and the phrase "hidden clause shocks real estate world," my legal team filed a series of injunctions with the Pennsylvania Department of State and the federal banking regulators. Quiet, precise paperwork, each page carrying the full weight of the law. By noon, every one of Matthew's personal and business accounts had been frozen. I wasn't there to see the moment he discovered it, but I could imagine it. Matthew storming into his private office, trying to access funds for his next flashy project, only to find every transaction denied. I pictured his face reddening, his voice rising, as he shouted at secretaries and bankers over the phone, demanding answers. And I smiled, not from cruelty, but from justice. Because this wasn't a fight, it was an inevitability. The regulators came next. 2 days later, state auditors and federal agents swept through Matthew's offices like a tidal wave. Files were seized, computers packed up, entire departments shut down. Investors who cheered him on just weeks before suddenly vanished, withdrawing funds and canceling contracts before their names could be tainted by his scandal. News crews parked outside his once pristine headquarters, cameras rolling as his empire was dissected piece by piece. The same journalists who had once fawned over his visionary leadership now used words like fraud, negligence, and criminal investigation. Matthew, so accustomed to the spotlight, began sneaking through back doors and service hallways, desperate to avoid the cameras. Sabrina didn't last long by his side. At first, she defended him publicly, parroting his excuses to anyone who would listen. But when her paycheck bounced and she learned that her own accounts were under review, her loyalty fractured. I made sure she had an easy escape route, a promotion to a clean, distant division of the company under my direct authority. It was a silent invitation, a lifeboat in a sinking sea. She took it without hesitation, leaving Matthew to flounder alone. His so-called allies followed. Executives who had once toasted Matthew's brilliance began returning my calls, pledging themselves to me with carefully rehearsed apologies. Each departure left him more isolated. Each defection stripped him of influence. By the end of the month, Matthew wasn't a king or even a leader. He was just a man pacing an empty office, surrounded by ghosts of power he never truly owned. I never visited him. I never called. There was no final confrontation, no shouting match, no satisfying explosion of anger. My silence was the blade, and his own arrogance pushed him onto it. From my top-floor office, I read the reports of his bankruptcy filings and watched the news segments about pending criminal charges. I saw photos of him emerging from court, suit wrinkled, hair unkempt, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffling stumble. And I felt nothing but clarity. I didn't need to strike him down, I thought, staring out at the city skyline Andrew and I had once dreamed of shaping. I only had to step aside and let him fall. Matthew had spent years climbing a ladder he thought was his. He never realized I was the one holding it steady, and that I was the one who finally let go. The city stretched beneath me like a living map, its steel and glass catching the pale morning light. From the top floor of Grant Real Estate's headquarters, I could see the outlines of every neighborhood Andrew and I had once walked through hand in hand, dreaming of what we'd built together. It had been 10 years since that night in the Grand Hall when Matthew tried to erase me with a smirk and a signature. 10 years since I'd walked out with nothing but a quiet vow and the memory of Andrew's voice whispering, "If anything ever happens to me, there's a way to protect you." Now, the company thrived under my leadership. Andrew's vision lived on, not through Matthew's arrogance, but through my patience, my planning, my refusal to let everything we built be devoured by greed. From this office, I didn't just see buildings and profit margins. I saw legacy, I saw survival, and I saw victory, quiet and absolute. The airport was bustling, a blur of rushing travelers and tinny intercom announcements. I was on my way to Chicago for a major development meeting when I caught a flash of a familiar figure slouched near a departure gate. Matthew. Even from a distance, I barely recognized him. His once tailored suits had been replaced by something rumpled and ill-fitting. His posture, once sharp with entitlement, was now hunched, defeated. For a moment, he didn't notice me. Then our eyes met, and he froze. Slowly, he walked toward me, each step hesitant, like a man approaching a ghost. When he finally reached me, his voice was little more than a rasp. "You destroyed me." The words hung between us, trembling with rage and grief. I met his gaze, steady and calm. "No, Matthew," I said softly. "You destroyed yourself. I just refused to be erased." For a second, there was silence, just the hum of the terminal around us. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. He turned away, retreating back into the faceless crowd. As I boarded my flight, I looked out the window one last time at the city skyline in the distance. He thought the will made him king, I reflected, a small, knowing smile tugging at my lips. Instead, it crowned me.